Good afternoon. I'm certainly excited to be here today. I want to thank Jude, Jim Nichols, and George for giving me the opportunity to join all of you fine folks this afternoon. My background includes aerospace CAD drafting. Within the aerospace industry, we do a lot of in-flight entertainment, STC work for foreign domestic airlines. And what I'd like to do for you this afternoon is give you a brief overview of some of the classified aircraft programs buried deep within the military-industrial complex. And we're actually going to break this down into three distinct categories. Category number one is what we term a black program. That's any program that has less than 5% congressional oversight. The second category is what we've termed a deep black program. And the third and final category is what's called a USAP, or Unacknowledged Special Access Program. If you work in one of these projects and the President asks you for specific details regarding that program, your mandatory reply is to be, Mr. President, no such project exists. So, it's appropriate that we begin with this particular aircraft right here. This is the Boeing Phantom Works Bird of Prey, declassified October 2002 under the current Bush administration. Now, this particular aircraft was the first aircraft to use single-piece composite aircraft construction in conjunction with 3D virtuality design components. Wow. $67 million was the procurement funding for this particular aircraft. And if you'd like to see this aircraft, it's currently hanging above an aircraft called Tacit Blue at the Air Force Museum, Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. 47 feet in length, 23-foot wingspan. 67 test flights were made between 1992 and 1999. Wow. And you'll notice here, there's very few seams in this aircraft whatsoever. No metal fasteners are used at all in this particular aircraft. And you'll notice the smooth contouring of the entire component. Everything is blended in, unlike the F-117 that was declassified November 10th, 1988. So that's the Boeing Phantom Works Bird of Prey. In this location, you have the air intake. The exhaust port is located at the aft end of the aircraft. Only one was actually built, so this is strictly a one-off prototype design. Here you can see some of the seams for the control surfaces, and then the starboard aileron in this location, and that's all you're going to see for seams in this particular aircraft. There are no skin seams whatsoever, as you would see on a conventional aircraft design. A good shot of the aft end of the Bird of Prey, and then the landing gear doors here, which would retract up, hiding most of the radar cross-section in that location. Good shot of the pilot, single pilot design, and again, if anyone wants to see this aircraft, it's currently at the Air Force Museum, Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, Dayton, Ohio. Now we're moving on to the Aviation Week Space Technology article on the Lockheed Skunk Works Polecat, a single one-off prototype unmanned aerial vehicle. $29 million was spent on this particular program. And by May of 2004, it was ready for its first flight. Unfortunately, this particular aircraft crashed not too far from the remote test site in Nevada. No longer exists. And so that's basically the bottom word on Polecat. Detroit Free Press, speaking about the secret ledger hides military projects. Pentagon black budget has tripled under the Reagan administration. So we're asking the question, how have these programs been funded and how have they been able to keep these secrets?
Oh, yeah.
The Defense Department's secret accounts, growth of the secret defense research and development in billions of dollars. If you look at the far left hand of this screen, you'll see that in 1981, the procurement was just over $500 million spent on black programs. By 1988, the number rose to $9.122 billion, a tremendous increase. Over here we have federal spending by category in billions of dollars for fiscal year 1988. We spent $25 billion on education. We spent $26 billion on agriculture. Transportation was $28 billion. But the Pentagon's black budget was $35 billion. So we're spending more on classified black budget programs than we actually are on education. So I'm asking the question, do we have our priorities set straight within the government here? And then just as the breakdown shows here, Air Force black budget for 1988, the total was $51.1 billion. Of that, $19 billion was the actual Air Force black budget program. So that's a breakdown of what these costs are really all about. In search of the Pentagon's billion-dollar hidden budgets, how the U.S. keeps its R&D spending under wraps. And that's really the question. How do they hide these programs from the public? I would certainly recommend that everyone here today obtain a copy of this particular document. It's called the RDT&E Programs R1. It stands for Research, Development, Test, and Evaluations R1. And in this document, approximately 24 pages in length, it gives you the breakdown of a number of different programs, including electronic countermeasures, troop transport movements, F-16 operations. And then as you further go through this document, many of these programs start falling off the radar screen, as you see here. Programs called Seek Bandit. It's a classified aircraft program. We don't know what it is. Seek Orange, classified aircraft program. Senior J, U.S. Air Force Special Access Program. We don't even know what these programs are. And over here we have Flag, Senior Year, and Forest Green. So not only do we not know what these programs are, we don't know how much was spent. So the bottom line being, you take the total amount from the knowns, and what you're left with are the unknowns, and that is the black budget. A-12 Avenger II was designed to be an all-weather attack aircraft to replace the A-6 intruder. By 1990, Dick Cheney had a procurement of 650 of these aircraft, but 1 year later, in 1991, the whole program was scrapped. $5 billion in tax dollars was spent on this program, and we have absolutely nothing to show for this program. So I'm asking the question, we really should have just received a refund check for this program. We would have been better off writing all of us a refund check, because now we have nothing to show for this program. Again, we have the A-12 Avenger II that was a joint McDonnell Douglas General Dynamics program, a tandem two-seat design, carrier-based operation. Here is the air intake on both sides of the pilot's compartment, just aft of the forward crew section. Good shot of the A-12 in flight. Would have been a very low radar cross-section aircraft if indeed it did go into production. The only known illustration that you're ever going to see within the public domain, which highlights the Lockheed ATB Advanced Technology Bomber Stealth Program. This was Lockheed's version. Of course, Northrop won the project, but Lockheed's version was an overgrown F-117 with a long tail boom and an inverted forward swept tail arrangement. This is the 1/5 scale mock-up here, and you can see some of the faceted flat plate technology also used on the F-117. So here we see the strategic long-range bomber. Wingspan was 152, and then again you can see the faceted flat plate technology. So that was the Lockheed Senior Peg. This graphic here illustrates the mismanagement of funds within the military-industrial complex. I just love the leopard skin instrument panel and the solid gold bomb sight, and over here you see our daycare centers and our schools dilapidated and derelict, falling apart, and the funding is completely wrong for these type programs. Tacit Blue was the first quad-redundant fly-by-wire flight control system that used a side-scanning radar. Only one was ever built. It is also at the Air Force Museum in Dayton, Ohio, so you can see it there. The aft end had two canted vertical stabilizers that were canted outward from the center line of the aircraft. Here you also see the exhaust port of Tacit Blue. And then this is the only known photograph showing the interior components and analog gauges of the cockpit section of Tacit Blue. An interesting French art type piece that shows the smooth contouring, somewhat similar to what we see in the B-2 stealth bomber. And then originally, prior to '88, during the rollout of the B-2, we actually didn't know what the configuration was. Many thought that it was a single straight trailing edge that you see in this illustration for 4 jet engines, which was correct. And then Rebel Corporation had a sort of a smooth contouring leading edge with a curvature and then a straight trailing edge, there is some evidence to indicate that at least 2 subscale flying prototypes of this particular aircraft actually did make it to the flying prototype stage. This is an interesting 90% scale sheet metal mock-up that was built for the Honda CRX SI release back in 1988, part of an advertising campaign. Approximately 150 feet across, and weighed 200,000 pounds, the whole thing built out of sheet metal. And when this particular commercial was aired on television, the phones at the Pentagon blew up because they had just about nailed the correct configuration of the B-2. The wing sweep angle is a bit too steep, and you'll notice over here, the chord of the wing is too thick. But generally speaking, without any inside information, Honda did a fairly successful job at recreating what the B-2 actually looked like before it was rolled out to the public. Now this is the actual B-2 here. Interesting to keep in mind that the cost of the B-2 bomber is $2.3 billion per aircraft. That's more than its own weight in gold, and so that's where our tax dollars are going. 172-foot wingspan, and you'll notice here the double W or sawtooth trailing edge, and that's going to become important as we move along here. Again, you can see the front view here with the 2 air intakes, a very smooth contouring design, unlike the faceted flat plates that we see on the F-117. Project Senior CJ from Washington Post spoke about unraveling stealth black world. Questions of cost and mission arise amid debate over secrecy. So even they're questioning this debate over secrecy. Now, some of the internal weapons that the B-2 carries. We know that it has conventional and nuclear armaments. We also know the B-2 carries what's called a dial yield, so they can take some of these nuclear weapons and go from 1 megaton all the way up to 10 megatons in yield. The only known illustration that you're going to see of the interior components of the B-2, as far as I'm concerned, no unclassified photograph has ever been showed which displays the engine access panels of the B-2 being removed. This is about the closest that we're ever going to get to see what is actually going on inside the B-2. Now, by 1983, Northrop spent $22.4 billion on research and development for the B-2 program and had nothing to show for it. A year later, in 1984, the U.S. Air Force changed its mind. They decided they no longer wanted a high-altitude bombing platform, but wanted a low-altitude bombing platform. Now that cost all of us $1 billion for the wing redesign. Here you see the single sawtooth trailing edge back in 1983, and then 1 year later, it got changed to the double W sawtooth trailing edge. Again, that was a $1 billion bill for all of us. And just to illustrate one more time, the single sawtooth moving on to the double W sawtooth trailing edge. Again, an interesting report from New York Times, which had the same type wing redesign. Now, we move on to an Aviation Week Space Technology report from March 9, 1992, which talked about a number of classified programs and details which are actually being used within the B-2 bomber. One of them being that the B-2 electrically charges the leading edge of the wing to reduce the radar cross-section, and then electrically charges the exhaust gases to reduce the infrared signature. Now, what happens when you do this, according to a 1968 report from Northrop, is there is a resulting drag coefficient reduction up to 60%. And these engineers were very upset that this kind of technology was not being filtered down to the civilian airline industry, which would help all of us. This could in turn reduce the fuel consumption on airliners by 60%, just a tremendous increase in efficiency. But what also happens here is when you electrically charge the leading edge of the wing and then ionize negatively the exhaust gases, you set up what's called a gravity wave, where there's a gravity well in front of the aircraft and a gravity hill in back of the aircraft, essentially turning this thing into an over-unity device where you can shut down the engines and this thing will run on its own. So very interesting. Avro, which is now British Aerospace, had their own design for electrogravitic propulsion aircraft. And then we have the similar early B-2 concept design. and then following up with the final design of the B2 on the bottom here. Now this is the patent, that's number 4,989,006. One of the technologies used on the B2 is a radar absorbing technology. This is the patent that actually shows how this is done, embedded inside the leading edge of the B2. Now, if you can't spend billions that Northrop has done, there's another way to do this. One way to make a conventional aircraft stealthy is to ionize the entire aircraft with a plasma stealth in front of the aircraft, and that's what's being shown in this patent right here by Boyd Bushman. He's a retired Lockheed Skunk Works engineer who came up with this particular design. Now this is the cost analysis of the B2 procurement funding. Now we mentioned by '83 they spent a grand total of $22.4 billion on the B2 program. And so we'll quickly break through some of these different costs here. We're going to give Northrop $35 million for the development of stealth technology. We're just going to give that to them off the bat. We're going to give them $65 million for their Pico Rivera plant, where many of the components were put together. To build Tacit Blue, which we already showed, we're going to give them $1 billion for that. $100,000 salary for 4,000 people, that's $400 million. To purchase computers, we're going to give them $2 billion for that, and then to purchase equipment, we'll throw in $2 billion for that. That gives us a grand total of $5.5 billion. We subtract that amount from the $22.4 billion that was spent, and we're left with a remaining $16.9 billion that disappeared into thin air. Absolutely no funding, no accounting for this missing $16.9 billion. We have no idea where this money went. It's just an absolute tragedy. I'm proposing that some of that funding was filtered off into a different, more advanced version of the B2, something that over 25,000 eyewitnesses in the Hudson Valley area saw and witnessed between 1982 and 1988. Thousands of people pulled off to the side of the road, saw this gigantic boomerang flying wing-shaped device that had a same type version of the B2, but the single sawtooth trailing edge identical to the original design of the B2 prior to the wing redesign. Now, if you doubt me on some of these electrogravitic propulsion technologies, I invite you to pick up a copy of this book. It's called Electrogravitic Systems by Thomas Malone. Reports on a new propulsion methodology, specifically goes into details of how this system works on the B2. Leslie Kuba from Electric Spacecraft Journal wrote a really good review here. She says, an underlying theme is that T.T. Brown propulsion, once developed, will usher in an age of flight so revolutionary it will make all previous aviation from the Wright brothers to space shuttles constitute the Stone Age of flight. That's exactly what we're talking about here. DARPA program called the QSP, that stands for Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency. The QSP was the Quiet Supersonic Platform. This was a government program to determine how we can reduce our sonic footprint and get rid of the sonic boom for military and civilian applications by extending the nose of the aircraft, having it blend into a supercritical wing, thereby reducing some of the shock waves. Interesting report from Popular Science that spoke specifically about electrochromic panels and how that they're taking what's behind the aircraft and electrically projecting that image onto the forward top surface of the aircraft, essentially making it blend into the background and causing it to become practically invisible. Already in the field now, can be retrofitted for troop transport, Army personnel, tanks. It's already a done deal, already being used now. Sneaky Pete, another version that led to something called Model 100, was designed in 1984. It was designed and built by a company called Task Engineering in California. Test pilots were Dick Rattan and Mike Melville. It looked very similar to a Long Easy that you would see at a local air show. Lockheed Skunk Works Project Q, or Quartz, was designed to be a single pilot reconnaissance high altitude platform. Unfortunately, only 2 subscale models were ever built. Both of these crashed, and that was the final analysis for Project Q, which had a wingspan of 185 feet and 2 retractable outrigger wheels at the extreme tips of the aircraft. A 1973 design report called CL 1980 from Lockheed Skunk Works. Ben Rich was the senior project design engineer on this particular program. You can see the engine nacelles, very similar to the SR-71. And then again, you can see the forward shine section, almost similar to the SR-71 here. But instead of having twin vertical stabilizers that we see on the SR, this particular aircraft only had a single vertical stabilizer. However, that aircraft was never built. Moving on to the Project Fish from General Dynamics Convair. This aircraft was designed to fly at Mach 4, 90,000 feet altitude. This would have been the competitor, actually it was the competitor to the A-12 by Lockheed. Of course, Convair lost the contract. Would have been the actual winner though. A 67-degree swept delta wing configuration using 2 ramjet engines. A very high-speed aircraft that was designed to be airdropped from a B-58 Hustler. Now, the acronym FISH stands for First Invisible Super Hustler. And you can see here the 2 ramjet engines at the aft end of the craft. Also here, the nice 67-degree blended swept wing configuration. Now, if there was any type of malfunction with the smaller engines that could be jettisoned out the side of these panels of the aircraft here, the pilot would be left to land at a very high angle of attack at about 170 to 180 knots. So you'd have to be a really good pilot to land this. And then also you see here the fish being loaded onto the belly lower section of the B-58 Hustler. Moving on to the Boeing Joint Strike Fighter. They lost the contract to the current JSF by Lockheed. Some might say that it was a political decision by Lockheed One. Might have been the same reason why they won the F-22. So that's the JSF from Boeing. Now we have the Lentemco Vought Atom 2, that stands for Air Deflection and Modulation. This was a design proposal to take advantage of something called the Coanda effect, where they would take bleed-off thrust from the engine and direct it right over the top surface of the wing, causing a low pressure zone, allowing this thing to take off vertically. And then that's Atom 2. You can see it was a twin tandem pilot type design, air intakes on both sides of the pilot's compartment. A 1959 report from Boeing, now declassified, was confidential at one time, but here they highlighted a number of very interesting wind tunnel test miles that had this similar blended 75-degree swept wing configuration that we've already shown before. Here you see 2 vertical stabilizers and the same supercritical 75-degree triangular swept wing configuration, and that's certainly going to become important too. Boeing's Softacrab, the only known illustration that I've ever been able to find on this particular aircraft. It was a stealthy troop insertion aircraft. Anywhere between 24 and 36 troops can be used in this particular design that had a vertical takeoff capability. Up here you see the Humvee being loaded into the aft end of this craft. And then I always like to point out that in this document, it says range and wind tunnel tested. So at the very least, something called Softacrab was either built, flown, or a test model. Wind tunnel test model was actually built of this particular aircraft. Vintage 1960s report from Lockheed on an infantry in-ground effect aircraft that could actually take an entire infantry division on a combat run. You'll see the cutaway here of helicopters, armored personnel, small tanks, troop transport. They have different aircraft all embedded in this entire ship. So it would have been a logistical nightmare to do the structural analysis, but again, it was an actual paper designed by Lockheed. 1976 report from McDonnell Douglas, specifically talking about gigantic lenticular, disc-shaped craft, diamond-shaped craft that are lighter than air vehicles, between 600 and 800 feet in diameter, gigantic cargo lifter. So just making the point that the next time you go out at night and you see this gigantic 800-foot diameter ship that's floating silently over your head, just remember it might be one of ours via this 1976 McDonnell Douglas report. Skyship project talking about a heavy lifter construction, lighter than air vehicle, with a 400-ton capability, the same type, almost conventional dirigible design, just illustrating that the whole concept of airships being phased out is completely false. It's at the cutting edge today. Now, these aircraft have been seen in Belgium in the early 90s, also in southern Illinois in the late 1990s, have been sighted all over the world, completely silent. This article asked the question, lighter than air vehicles, are they on the rise? They're absolutely, definitely on the rise, and you can see just a sense of scale here. We've got a little ship down here, and then this entire deltoid blimp is dwarfing this ship at the bottom, so just to give you a size of scale of this particular aircraft. Now, this is an accurate illustration of what was seen by over 25,000 eyewitnesses in the Hudson Valley area. Reported a boomerang flying wing type configuration with a single sawtooth trailing edge. There was a series of light patterns on the port and starboard undersurface of the aircraft, and one large light in the bottom center part of the aircraft. Now, the official government explanation on this is that this was nothing more than a group of crackpot ultralight pilots flying at night in formation. That was the explanation. That is what they said it was. So, you know, here we have an ultralight pilot here, and of course this would be at night, and you'd be flying no more than 20 feet from the other guy, so that's very dangerous. But they forgot to mention that practically all ultralights are powered by a 2-cycle Rotax 447 engine that you can hear between 3 and 5 nautical miles away. So it's not consistent with what the eyewitnesses reported hearing and seeing. So we can throw that particular explanation out the window. Lenticular re-entry vehicle by North American Aviation, a 1960s proposal for their atomic bombing platform, a rapid response bombing platform. The F-108 Rapier was a complementary design, something that was to fly as a wingman to the North American Aviation XB-70. A full-scale half part of the mock-up was actually built and never actually went into production. So that's the F-108 Rapier. Our report here, patent number 5,984,231, speaking about a forward swept wing Northrop Mach 3 interceptor aircraft that would be carrier based. So there's some good evidence to indicate that we have something in the inventory that looks like this in the field at this time. Moving on to the top secret TR-3A Black Manta, also known as the Manta Ray. Top secret, reshaping the look of America's air power. This is from Popular Mechanics. This particular aircraft was used in conjunction with F-117s during Desert Storm in 1991. It was used as a digital real-time reconnaissance intelligence gathering aircraft, had a crew of 1. It was a General Dynamics McDonnell Douglas program. Teledyne Ryan was retained as a subcontractor. There was an air intake on both sides of the pilot's compartment, 2 vertical stabilizers that were canted inward toward the center line of the aircraft. And also it's important to note that this particular aircraft was able to operate from carriers. And I did receive a very reliable report from a KC-135 boom operator who in 1991 was refueling 3 particular aircraft. 2 of these were F-117s that took on fuel from the KC-135 boom. When these 2 F-117s broke away, this particular aircraft came up, he took on fuel, and he broke away. So we have his report to go along with a number of other eyewitnesses. Also, it's interesting to note that for every 3 F-117s, there is 1 TR-3A. Now we know there's 59 F-117s built, so that equates to approximately 19 TR-3As currently in the inventory now. Here is the Teledyne Ryan patent, and you can see some of the pattern recognition here. It's the same air intake configuration, the same canted vertical stabilizers, and then the pilot's compartment is located up center in the front. This is the only known article ever printed about something that took place in September of 1994. This is the RAF Boscombe down crash of a top secret stealth aircraft. It was an American aircraft. All we know is that it suffered some type of malfunction. It might have been the landing gear failed. There was a crew of 2, It looked very similar to the YF-23, which is a Northrop product. It had two inward canted vertical stabilizers. The craft was towed back and put inside a hangar, and a tarp was put over the midsection of the aircraft, exposing the nose and the tail section of the aircraft, so that could be seen by eyewitnesses. The next night, a C-5, which is shown over here, was flown in. It was loaded into the C-5, and then everything was shipped back to Air Force Plant 42 Palmdale, and that's the last we ever heard of it. Nothing has ever been said more about this particular aircraft. It might have looked similar to this, a Northrop design called the Astra, with a 75-degree swept wing configuration and two inward canted vertical stabilizers. Popular Science talked about America's $1 billion high-flying 4,400-mile-an-hour ramjet. Reports started coming out in the press in the late 1980s that we were phasing out the SR-71. One reason was costs involved in keeping that program alive, and also the idea that we had satellites that could do the job better than a manned reconnaissance aircraft. But that's not consistent with thousands of eyewitness reports of a XB-70-like mothership that's been sighted all over Lancaster, Palmdale area. Two eyewitness reports of landing at Edwards Air Force Base that had a very interesting blended forward chine configuration. Also two retractable canards for low-speed operation. And then the chine would taper back to a modified delta wing with 16-foot-high winglets at the wingtips. And in Burbank, from this 1992 report, we see something being loaded into the forward section of the C-5. That's what eyewitnesses reported seeing. Some type of very unusual design being loaded into the forward section of the C-5. And that gives you an idea of what actually took place. This is an A-12 being loaded into a C-5 here. You can see how long this thing was. So what was being loaded was chopped at about right here, and the rest of it was full. Now, if you took